The stars had stories, and every child in the Orion Confederacy knew them by heart in the nursery chambers of the Valori homeworld. Young larvae would curl their segmented bodies tight as their elders sang of the Maker's beings of soft flesh and fragile bone who had walked among the stars when the universe was young, who had touched barren worlds and breathed life into empty soil, who had vanished into the cosmic void and left behind only whispers and wonder on the crystalline towers of Sinter Prime. Scholars spent centuries studying the sacred glyphs carved into ancient monoliths, symbols that predated their entire civilization by tens of thousands of years, markings that spoke of two-legged creatures who carried fire in their hands and hope in their hearts across 17 spacefaring civilizations. The story remained the same. The Makers had existed. The Makers had created, and the Makers had disappeared. Ambassador Kefvan of the Meraki Dominion considered all of this to be primitive nonsense. Sat in his private chamber aboard the diplomatic station orbiting the neutral world of Thesan, his forearms folded across his broad chest as he reviewed the latest religious disputes flooding the communication networks. The Valori theocracy had declared another holy month, and their priests were demanding that all member species observe a period of silence in honor of the Makers, a request that the more practical civilizations found both inconvenient and ridiculous. Giron was a pragmatist who had spent 40 years navigating the complex politics of the Confederacy, and he had no patience for mythology dressed up as diplomacy. His species, the Meraki, had evolved on a harsh desert world where survival demanded logic and efficiency, not prayers to vanished gods. He was about to draft a formal objection to the Valori demands when his communication console erupted with emergency alerts. Ambassador, his aide stammered through the audio link. Something has emerged from the spatial anomaly near Sector 7. Kefvan felt his secondary hearts skip a beat. The anomaly in Sector 7 had existed for as long as any species could remember. A swirling wound in space that the Valori called the Gateway of the Makers, and that scientists simply called unexplainable in 50,000 years of recorded galactic history. Nothing had ever come through it until now. Show me. Kefvan commanded. The holographic display flickered to life and revealed a vessel unlike anything he had ever seen. It was enormous, nearly 3 kilometers long, its hull scarred and pitted by damage that spoke of an unimaginably long journey. Strange symbols covered its surface, symbols that made Kefvan's blood run cold because he recognized them from the images the Valori priests broadcast during their endless religious ceremonies. The sacred glyphs of the Makers. This is impossible. He whispered. His console chirped again, and this time his aide's voice trembled with something between terror and awe. Sir, the vessel is broadcasting a message, audio only, in a language that our translation systems are struggling to process. Put it through. Static filled the chamber, followed by a sound that would change the galaxy forever. It was a voice, unmistakably organic, weary and confused but undeniably alive. This is the UNSS Lazarus Rising calling any vessels in range. We have experienced critical system failures and require assistance. Our crew is awakening from emergency cryogenic suspension, and we need to know our current location and date. Please respond. Is anyone still out there? Kefvan sat frozen as the message repeated. The language was ancient, a tongue that existed only in Valori scripture and academic databases. Dead for longer than most civilizations had existed, and yet here it was, spoken by a living being. His console exploded with incoming communications as every ship, station, and government in sensor range tried to contact him. Simultaneously, the Valori High Priest was already screaming about divine return and demanding that all vessels maintain a respectful distance from the sacred ark. The Carthene military commander was ordering his fleet to battle stations because anything emerging from an anomaly was a potential threat. The Synthery delegation was simply transmitting mathematical equations, their crystalline minds trying to calculate the probability of what they were witnessing. Kithvan ignored all of them. He opened a direct channel to the strange vessel, his voice steady despite the tremor in his heart. Unknown vessel. This is Ambassador Kethvan of the Meraki Dominion speaking on behalf of the Orion Confederacy. We receive your transmission. Please identify yourselves and the nature of your mission. The pause that followed lasted an eternity. Then the voice returned. And this time Kethvan could hear other sounds in the background, alarms, voices calling out in confusion. The hum of ancient machinery struggling to function. Orion Confederacy. I am not familiar with that designation. This is Commander Elena Vasquez of the United Nations starship Lazarus Rising. We are a colony vessel from Earth carrying human survivors. We departed our homeworld approximately 50,000 years ago by our calculations. Though our system suggests significant temporal displacement occurred during transit, Kethvan felt the universe shift beneath him. Humans. The word echoed through his mind like thunder. Humans were not real. Humans were mythology. Humans were the makers from children's stories and religious texts and archaeological mysteries. Humans were supposed to be extinct, ascended, vanished, anything but alive and asking for directions. Commander Vasquez, he said slowly, choosing each word with care. You say you are human. The species known in our records as the Makers. Another pause. I am not sure what you mean by makers, the voice replied. We are human, yes, we are explorers and colonists. We left Earth because our world was dying, and we hoped to find a new home among the stars. We did not make anything except a very long and apparently very troubled journey. The communication networks had gone silent. Every being in the sector was listening, recording, analyzing. The Valori priests had begun chanting. The Korathine had powered down their weapons in confusion. The Synthery had stopped transmitting entirely. Their logic matrices overwhelmed, then realized that everything he had ever believed about the universe, about history, about the nature of civilization itself, was about to be rewritten. The Makers were not ancient lore. The Makers were not departed gods. The Makers were tired and confused and asking for help. The galaxy would never be the same. Commander Elena Vasquez had imagined first contact 1,000 times during her training, but she had never imagined it would happen while she was still picking ice crystals from her hair and trying to remember her own name. Cryogenic suspension was not a gentle process. The human body was not designed to sleep for millennia, and waking from it felt like being dragged through broken glass while someone screamed equations into your ears. Elena stood in the command center of the Lazarus Rising, surrounded by flickering consoles and the groaning protests of systems that should have failed centuries ago. Watching through the main viewport as alien vessels of impossible design surrounded her ship, they were beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The Valori craft looked like living things, their hulls covered in patterns that shifted and pulsed with bioluminescent light. The Korathine warships were angular and brutal, bristling with weapons that made Earth's most advanced technology look like children's toys. The Synthery vessels were geometric perfection, crystalline structures that caught starlight and scattered it into rainbows. Elena had trained for decades to meet alien life with calm professionalism. She had studied protocols and practiced speeches and memorized cultural sensitivity guidelines. None of that prepared her for what happened when the first alien delegation boarded her ship. The Valori High Priest entered the airlock chamber first, his insectoid body moving with surprising grace despite his size, his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting in 1,000 fractured images. He saw Elena standing there in her crumpled uniform, with dark circles under her eyes and dried nutrient pasted on her sleeve, and he fell to his knees and began to weep. The makers have returned, he keened, his voice echoing through the chamber in harmonics that made Elena's teeth ache. The prophecy is fulfilled. The children of the stars are blessed. We are worthy. We are saved. Elena stared at him in complete bewilderment. I am sorry, she said slowly, but I think there has been some kind of mistake. The Meraki ambassador, Kethvan, stepped forward with considerably more composure. Though Elena could see the tension in his forearms and the way his tail twitched against the deck plating. Commander Vasquez, he said, you must understand that your species, humanity, has not been seen in this galaxy for approximately 50,000 years. In that time, you have become the subject of extensive mythology, religion, and scholarly debate. Mythology, Elena repeated flatly. The makers, the Valori priest moaned from the floor. You seeded the stars with life. You touched barren worlds and created civilizations. You taught the primitive species fire and language and compassion. You are the parents of all sentient life in the Orion Arm. Elena felt her legs go weak, and she grabbed the nearest console for support. That is not possible, she whispered. But even as she said it, memories stirred in the back of her mind. The Lazarus Rising had not been the only shipper's final project. The desperate last effort of a dying civilization had launched 17 Ark vessels into the void, each carrying thousands of colonists and vast stores of genetic material and terraforming equipment. The ships had scattered in different directions, programmed to seek out habitable worlds and seed them with Earth life, to give humanity's children a chance even if humanity itself did not survive. Elena had always assumed the other ships had failed. She had never imagined they might have succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The other vessels, she said, her voice barely audible. The other Ark ships, they made it. They actually made it. Kethvan nodded slowly. According to our oldest records, vessels matching your description appeared throughout this region of space tens of thousands of years ago. They found worlds that were barren and made them bloom. They found primitive life and guided its evolution. They built the foundations of every civilization you see before you today. The priest finally rose from his knees, his eyes still wet with tears. You did not just create life, Commander. You stayed with us. Your ancestors walked among ours. They taught and healed and protected. They lived and loved and died on our worlds. We carry your legacy in our very cells. Elena thought of her crewmates still waking in the cryogenic bays below. 847 souls who had survived an impossible journey only to discover that their species had accidentally become gods. She thought of her own family, long dead on a world that probably no longer existed, who had sent her into the void with nothing but hope. She thought of the other ships, the other crews, the colonists who had chosen to stay awake while their companions slept, who had dedicated their short human lives to nurturing alien worlds they would never see flourish. Those people had been scientists and farmers and teachers. They had been doctors and engineers and storytellers. They had been ordinary humans doing extraordinary things because that was what humans did when everything seemed lost and somehow impossibly. They had built a galaxy. We did not come here to be worshipped, Elena said finally, straightening her spine and meeting the priest's compound eyes. We came here to survive, to find a new home, to continue existing in whatever small way we could. But you are the makers. The priest protested. No, Elena said firmly. We are survivors. We are refugees. We are the last remnants of a species that refused to go quietly into the dark. We are not gods, and we never were. Kethvan watched her with an expression she could not read. Commander, he said quietly, what you are and what you have become in the eyes of the galaxy are two very different things. And I am not certain that distinction will matter to those who have spent millennia praying to your memory. Elena looked out through the viewport at the assembled fleets, at the vessels representing civilizations that her ancestors had somehow created, at the living legacy of humanity's desperate final act. She had wanted to find a home. Instead, she had found a family, billions strong, who thought she was divine, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. "Get me a direct channel to every ship in the sector," she said to Kethvon. "And someone please find me a cup of coffee. Because if I am going to explain to an entire galaxy that their gods are actually just very tired refugees, I am going to need all the help I can get." The ambassador's translator struggled with the word coffee, but he nodded anyway. The universe had just gotten considerably more complicated, and Elena suspected the complications were only beginning. 3 weeks after the Lazarus Rising emerged from the anomaly, the Orion Confederacy began to tear itself apart. Elena watched the chaos unfold from the observation deck of the diplomatic station where she and her crew had been relocated. Her coffee cup long empty and her patients wearing thin. The Valori theocracy had declared the humans sacred relics and demanded they be transported immediately to the Temple of Origins on their homeworld, where they would be given proper divine accommodation and consulted on matters of spiritual importance. The Mraki Dominion had released a formal statement declaring the humans to be obvious imposters, clever aliens exploiting ancient mythology for political advantage. Because the real makers had transcended physical form millennia ago, the Karathine Empire had simply started mobilizing their fleets. Though nobody was quite sure whether they intended to capture the humans or protect them, and through it all, Elena kept asking the same question that nobody seemed interested in answering. "Can I see the records?" she said for what felt like the 100th time. Standing before the assembled representatives of 12 different species in the station's main conference chamber. "I want to see everything you have about the makers. Every historical document, every religious text, every archaeological finding." The Valori high priest, whose name was Silphery, clicked his mandibles in distress. "The sacred scriptures are not meant for casual examination," he protested. "They are divine revelations preserved for millennia, through careful tradition and ritual. They are also apparently about my species," Elena replied calmly. "And I would like to know what they say." Ambassador Kethvon had become something of an ally over the past weeks. Perhaps because pragmatists recognized each other across species lines. "I have already submitted a formal request for archive access on the commander's behalf," he said. 17 civilizations possess maker artifacts and records. The process of compilation will take time. How much time? Several months, perhaps years. The bureaucratic considerations alone are enormously complex. Elena closed her eyes and counted to 10. A meditation technique she had learned during astronaut training that felt increasingly inadequate for her current situation. "Fine," she said. "Then let me start with something simpler. I want to see the Valori scriptures. The ones you claim describe my people." Silthery's compound eyes went wide with horror. "Impossible. Heretical. The sacred texts cannot simply be handed to outsiders, even if those outsiders are technically the divine beings the texts describe. Why? Not because the texts are sacred. And what makes them sacred? The fact that they describe the makers, and the makers are standing right here asking to read them." The circular logic seemed to short-circuit something in the priest's brain, and he fell silent, his mandibles working soundlessly as he struggled to process the theological contradiction. Ketham made a sound that Elena had learned was Mraki laughter, perhaps. The ambassador suggested diplomatically a compromise could be reached. The commander could be shown a portion of the texts under supervised conditions. As a gesture of good faith, the other representatives murmured among themselves. The Syntheri who communicated through light patterns rather than speech, flickered in what Elena's translator described as reluctant agreement. The Carathene general, a massive reptilian creature named Thrakgor, simply nodded once, his yellow eyes never leaving Elena's face, and so Elena found herself, 6 hours later, sitting in a secure chamber surrounded by alien clergy, watching as ancient documents were projected onto holographic displays. What she saw broke her heart and filled her with wonder in equal measure. Sacred texts were not mystical prophecies or divine commandments, they were instruction manuals. The first document was a medical guide, written in simple language with careful diagrams, explaining basic wound treatment and disease prevention for a species that had only recently developed agriculture. Another was an engineering primer, teaching the fundamentals of metal working and tool construction. A third was simply a collection of stories, fables about kindness and cooperation, and the importance of caring for one another. And scattered throughout every text were personal notes, messages from the humans who had written them. Remember that every life has value. One margin note read, "Even when resources are scarce, find ways to share. If you are reading this, you have already proven that you can learn," said another. "Never let anyone tell you that knowledge is forbidden. We will not be here forever," a third message warned. "But we want you to carry on after we are gone, not because we are special, but because you are." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, and she could not try to stop them. These were not sacred scriptures. These were letters from parents to children, written by humans who knew they would die on alien worlds, who knew they would never see the civilizations they were helping to build, who poured everything they had into ensuring that their adopted families would survive and thrive. "These are not religious texts," she said finally. A voice rough with emotion silvery bristled defensively. "They are the words of the makers, passed down through generations." "Yes," Elena agreed. "They are the words of humans. Ordinary humans who loved you enough to teach you everything they knew, who gave you medicine and tools and stories because they wanted you to have better lives. They are not sacred revelations from departed gods. They are love letters from people who chose to be your parents." The silence in the chamber was absolute. Elena stood and faced the assembled clergy. "I need to speak to the entire Confederacy," she said. "Everyone needs to see this. Everyone needs to understand what these documents really are. That would cause chaos." Kethvon warned. "There is already chaos," Elena replied. "At least this would be chaos based on truth." She did not wait for permission. She walked to the chamber's communication console and began uploading every document to the public networks, her human fingers moving across alien interfaces with surprising confidence. "You were not created by gods," she broadcast to every world that could receive her signal. "You were raised by parents who loved you enough to give you everything they had." Behind her, the Valori priest fell to his knees once more, but this time he was not weeping with joy, he was weeping with grief, for a faith that had just been transformed into something far more beautiful and far more painful than simple worship. And across the galaxy, millions of beings listened to her words and began to question everything they had ever believed about themselves and their origins. The truth was loose now. There would be no putting it back. Elena had expected consequences for her broadcast, and she was not disappointed. Within hours of her transmission, the Valora theocracy declared her a heretic and issued orders for the immediate seizure of all human survivors. Within days, 3 civilizations had descended into civil conflict as factions argued over whether the humans were genuine makers spreading dangerous lies or imposters who should be eliminated before they caused more damage. Within a week, the Carathene Empire had moved its war fleet to the border of Valori space, not to attack, but to ensure that no one else attacked first. Lena watched all of this from a holding cell on the diplomatic station, where she had been placed For her own protection by authorities who could not agree on what to do with her, her crew was scattered across the station. Similarly confined, similarly helpless, 847 humans against the combined might of a galactic civilization. The odds were not favorable when the guards came for her. Elena did not resist. They led her through corridors filled with anxious diplomats and angry clergy, past viewports that showed warships from a dozen species, maintaining tense standoffs in the space around the station. She was brought to the Grand Assembly Chamber, where representatives from every major civilization had gathered to determine her fate. The room was enormous, designed to accommodate beings of wildly different sizes and atmospheric requirements. Valori priests clustered in one section, their compound eyes fixed on Elena with expressions she could not read. Meraki diplomats occupied another area, their forearms folded and their tails coiled tight with tension. The crystalline synthery floated in specialized chambers, their light-based communications creating a constant subtle shimmer. And at the center of the assembly, presiding over the tribunal, sat High Priest Siltheri, his robes gleaming with sacred symbols that Elena now recognized as human alphabet letters, preserved and venerated for 50,000 years without anyone understanding their true meaning. Elena Vasquez, Siltheri intoned, his voice carrying through the chamber with practiced authority. You stand accused of heresy against the Maker faith, of spreading false doctrine designed to undermine the spiritual foundations of galactic civilization, of claiming divine lineage while simultaneously denying divine nature. Elena stood straight and met his gaze without flinching. Those accusations seem contradictory. She observed. Silence, Siltheri commanded. You will speak only when questioned directly. Elena considered this instruction for approximately 2 seconds before discarding it entirely. No, she said clearly. I will not be silent. I have been silent enough. My people have been silent for 50,000 years, dead and gone, while you turned our memory into something we never intended to be. The chamber erupted in outraged noise from a dozen different species. Siltheri raised his forelimbs for order, and eventually the chaos subsided. You deny that your species created galactic civilization, he said accusingly. No, Elena replied. I accept that humans helped seed worlds with life and guided primitive species toward civilization. What I deny is that we were gods. What I deny is that we deserve worship. What I deny is that you need us to be divine in order to justify your own existence. She began walking toward the central platform, ignoring the guards who moved to stop her until Kethvon waved them back. You have spent 50,000 years building temples to people who just wanted you to live, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You have fought wars over whose interpretation of our instruction manuals was correct. You have killed each other over disagreements about which sacred glyphs should be displayed on which holy days. She reached the platform and turned to face the full assembly. And you did all of this because it was easier than accepting that you were always capable of greatness on your own. Her human crew had been working while she was imprisoned, and now the chambers, holographic systems flickered to life without authorization, displaying images that made the assembled beings gasp and cry out. A human family eating dinner together, laughing at a joke, completely ordinary and completely unaware of the camera recording theme. A group of children playing a ball game, their movements clumsy and enthusiastic, their faces lit with simple joy. An old woman reading a story to her grandchildren, her voice gentle and patient, her eyes full of love. These are your gods, Elena said quietly. These are the makers you have worshipped for millennia. We were scared and hopeful and flawed. We argued about what to have for dinner. We made terrible jokes that no one laughed at. We loved each other badly and tried to do better the next day. The images continued cycling through humanity's final archive, preserved aboard the Lazarus, rising as a record of the species they had once been. Weddings and funerals and birthday parties, scientists debating and artists creating and workers building ordinary people living ordinary lives, never knowing that their descendants would be mistaken for deities. We were not makers, Elena said. We were just people, fragile and temporary, and determined to matter anyway. The humans who stayed behind on your worlds did not teach you because they were divine. They taught you because that is what you do when you love someone. You give them everything you have and hope it is enough. The chamber had gone completely silent. Even the Synthri had stopped their light patterns. Ella looked at Silthri, at the priest who had ordered her arrested for heresy, at the being whose entire worldview she had just demolished. I am sorry, she said, and she meant it. I am sorry that we are not what you wanted us to be. I am sorry that we are not powerful enough to solve all your problems, or wise enough to answer all your questions. But I am not sorry for telling you the truth. She spread her arms wide, encompassing the entire assembly. You do not need gods, she declared. You never did. You built civilizations and crossed the stars and created wonders that would make my ancestors weep with pride. You did that, not us. We just helped you get started. Silthri stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, the ancient priest lowered himself to his knees, not in worship this time, in something that looked almost like gratitude. Then teach us, he said quietly, not as gods to worshippers, but as parents to children. Show us who you really were, and help us understand who we can truly become. Elena felt tears threatening again, and she let them come. That, she said, is all we ever wanted, around the chamber. One by one, beings of 100 different species rose from their seats, not to attack, not to worship, to listen, and finally, after 50,000 years, the conversation could begin. The galaxy did not change overnight. Elena had never expected it. Would old beliefs did not crumble simply because someone presented evidence against them and civilizations that had spent millennia building their identities around. Maker worship could not simply abandon everything they knew. But change did come, slowly and painfully and beautifully. Spreading like light across the darkness between stars, the Valori did not abandon their faith. Instead, over the months that followed Elena's speech in the assembly chamber, they began to transform it into something new. The temples remained standing, but their purpose shifted. Where once priests had chanted prayers to departed gods, they now taught the philosophy that those ancient humans had actually intended to share, the belief that every life had value, that knowledge should be free, that caring for others was the highest calling any being could pursue. Solthari himself led this transformation. The same priest who had once demanded Elena's imprisonment now working tirelessly to reinterpret the sacred texts in light of their true meaning. The makers did not ask us to worship them, he declared in a sermon that was broadcast across Valori space. They asked us to become the best versions of ourselves, to carry on their work of building and nurturing and protecting. That is the true faith. Not blind devotion, but active love. The Korathines surprised everyone. The massive reptilian warriors had always prided themselves on their strength and their martial traditions, claiming descent from the Maker's warrior aspect, based on ancient texts that described humans fighting against impossible odds. When they learned that humans had been small and soft and biologically unremarkable, many expected them to reject the truth entirely. Instead, General Thrakor called a gathering of the greatest Korathine clan leaders and spoke words that would reshape his entire culture. We revered the Makers because we believed they were mighty, he said, his deep voice rumbling through the assembly hall. But the truth is far more impressive. They were weak and fragile, and they conquered the stars anyway. They were soft and short-lived, and they built civilizations that outlasted them by epochs. That is not weakness. That is the greatest strength of all. The Korathine became humanity's most devoted allies. Not because humans were powerful, but because they represented the triumph of will over limitation, where others saw frailty. The warriors saw inspiration. The murky pragmatists approached the situation with characteristic practicality. Ambassador Kefan drafted a formal proposal for the establishment of a human settlement on an unclaimed world near the galactic center, complete with resource allocations and trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. "You have been refugees long enough," he told Elena when he presented the proposal. "It is time for your people to have a home again." Elena accepted with tears in her eyes. They called the new world New Terra, a small planet with blue oceans and green continents that reminded the human survivors of the Earth they had lost so long ago. The Lazarus Rising made its final journey to settle into orbit around this new home. Its ancient engines finally allowed to rest after 50,000 years of faithful service, the 847 survivors began building, planting, creating. They were not gods, and they never would be. But they were alive. And they were free, and they had a future ships from every civilization came to visit New Terra in the years that followed, not pilgrims seeking divine wisdom, but students and scientists and simply curious beings who wanted to meet the legendary makers in person and discover that they were neither legendary nor divine human. Children grew up playing with Valori larvae and Carathene hatchlings, and Syntheri crystal spawn human. Elders shared stories with alien philosophers, comparing mythologies and finding unexpected common ground. And slowly, steadily, the galaxy began to heal from the shock of discovering that its gods had been ordinary people all along. Elena lived to see New Terra flourish. She watched the first generation born on their new world take their first steps under an alien sun. She presided over the establishment of the first interspecies academy, where beings from every civilization could come to study together as equals. She grew old surrounded by family, both human and otherwise, loved and respected not as a deity but as a grandmother and a teacher and a friend. On her final day, she sat on the balcony of her small house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple that no human had ever seen before. The Lazarus Rising emerged from the void. A young Valori scholar sat beside her, one of many students who had traveled to New Terra to learn from the surviving humans. Commander Vasquez, the young scholar asked hesitantly, "May I ask you something? Always, what did humans call themselves? Before you became the makers in our stories, before you became legend, what word did you use to describe your own nature?" Elena smiled, the expression creasing a face weathered by decades of a life she had never expected to live. She thought of the humans who had chosen to stay awake on alien worlds, who had taught and healed and loved knowing they would never see the fruits of their labor. She thought of her crew, who had crossed the impossible gulf between stars on nothing but hope and determination. She thought of her ancestors on dying Earth, who had looked at the end of everything and refused to accept it. "We had a lot of names," she said finally, "but the one that mattered most, the one that described who we really were at our best." She looked up at the sky, at the stars that her people had scattered themselves across so long ago, at the living legacy of humanity's desperate final gift to the universe. We called ourselves hopeful, above them. Ships from a dozen species crossed the twilight sky, carrying beings who had once prayed to human ghosts and now worked alongside human friends. The makers had returned, and they had set the record straight. They were not gods, they were not legends. They were simply, magnificently, stubbornly human, and that was more than enough.